Good evening to anybody who's watching online. A lot of things going on right now. A lot of COVID issues. We need to definitely. So I'm guessing we'll have at least a few watching online because they're not being able to be here tonight. Thank you for being here. Thanks to those who are with us in this small number tonight. But it's good to be here. Let's start by singing 116. Just remember, there is a card shower for Ray Ramsey, and they would like to have the cards here at the church building by next Wednesday night. And so Scott's going to pick them up and mail them down to Ray. 116. Oh, worship the King, all glorious above, and gratefully sing his wonderful love. Our shield and defender, the Ancient of Days, pavilioned in splendor and girded with praise. Thy bountiful care, what tongue can recite? It breathes in the air, it shines in the light, it streams from the hills, it descends to the plain, and sweetly distills in the dew and the rain. Frail children of dust, and feeble as frail, in thee do we trust, nor find thee to fail. Thy mercies, how tender, how firm to the end, our Maker, Defender, Redeemer, and Friend. Eddie, would you mind starting us in prayer tonight?
Father, we thank you for this evening. We thank you blessed us to be able to gather here. We pray for this class tonight that we can learn from it and apply it to our lives each and every day. We ask you that you would David as he teaches this lesson, help him to remember the things that he's prepared for us. We ask you to be with our country and its leaders, the president and all those in lowlands and high places that you work with that will indeed guide him and correct him in their ways. Ask you to be with us always. Accept our thanks for you blessing us with Jesus. I think he was willing to go through and save us from our sins. Please be with us now. Give us Christ in pray.
Amen. Thank you, Eddie. I don't think I'll need that tonight. I'm really excited about this class. I'm probably more excited than anybody else in here for this class because I love this kind of stuff. I've never taught this before. But it's been one of my joys over the last month or two as I've been working through the material on this class, figuring out how to do it. We're going to be talking about kings and queens, telling the stories of Israel and Judah in the years after King Solomon, and then down to the exile to Babylon in 586 BC. So a period of around 375 years, give or take a few years. We're going to begin tonight by starting with Rehoboam. And I thought, hi, Jamie. And I thought we'd start by doing something like we talked about on Sunday morning. Think about each of these guys with their, if you could summarize the years that they served in just a few sentences. What's going to be on their plaque? So here's Rehoboam, and every one of them I have a nickname for. And for him, it's going to be the anti-Lincoln. And that'll become obvious here in a little bit. This was not a guy who was about freedom. But he was a son of Solomon and an Ammonite mother. His folly and arrogance led to the separation of the kingdom. He did evil even as the religious element of the Jews came over to his side, and eventually he was defeated by Egypt. So that kind of summarizes up who Rehoboam was about. Before we get into Rehoboam, we got to tell a little bit about his backstory. Okay, this is sort of the time before Rehoboam. Tonight we're going to spend quite a bit of time here. We won't do as much over the next few weeks. But I want you to think a little bit about the nature of Israel and Judah at this time. Could Israel stay united? Now, after coming from Egypt as 12 tribes plus the Levites, for hundreds of years, remember what happens in the story of the book of Judges? What does it say at least 3 times in the book of Judges about the unity of that nation? It says 3 times, and there was no king in the land. When you think about Israel and the 12 tribes, they were not a united people once they entered into the promised land. Everybody had their own land, everybody had their own tribe, and they kind of ignored everybody else. In a way, it was kind of like, if you know much about the American colonies back during colonial days. Were they a united colonial group? If it would serve their interest, yes. But a lot of times they were not. And so the 12 tribes were 12 different nations, you might think. And so they remained a very diverse group of people. In Judges 9, though, there's a man by the name of Abimelech. And Abimelech stands up and basically says, hey, how about me? I'll be the leader. I'll be the ruler. How long did Abimelech last as basically ruler? 3 years. And then they tossed Abimelech aside during kind of a civil war. And then there was no king until the days of, who's the first king of Israel? Anybody know? Saul. Why was Saul made king? Do you remember?
Israel begged for a king.
Well, Israel begged for a king. They said, we want to be like the other nations. But why did they want to be like the other nations? Do you remember? We want somebody to do what? Take us out and lead us out into war. That's why, if you go and read Saul's story, that's why the people were begging Samuel for a king. And so Saul gets anointed king. Remember what tribe Saul was from? He was from the tribe of Benjamin. Now, should have had this over here. This is kind of the land of Israel and Judah. Judah's down here. The northern tribes are up here. Benjamin's right here in the middle. And so he served as something of a unifying force. You think about just going back again to the United States. Our capital is in Washington, D.C. Why is our capital in Washington, D.C.? You remember? Remember that from history class all those years ago? If you go and you look at a map of slave states in the South and free states in the North, where's the middle of it? Washington. It was a compromise between the southern states and the northern states. Because, you want to make sure that one side doesn't get too much power. And so Benjamin, under Saul, it was the kind of the center place. Well, Saul eventually gets killed by the Philistines, the ones whom he was supposed to go and attack and fight against. And who becomes the next king after Saul? David. David, what tribe is David from? David is from the tribe of Judah, way down south, the southern tribe of Judah. And so eventually the kingship passes into David's son, Solomon. And so you get into this story of David and Solomon. You got to remember that now the South is the one who are all in power. And that's going to become something very important here. If you get into Solomon's reign, and so much of it is good. I want you to, if you will, turn to chapter 4 of 1 Kings for just a second. We're not going to read very much here. But in 1 Kings chapter 4, there's almost kind of a tension going on with how people saw Solomon. Look down in 1 Kings 4 and verse 20. What's it say about the people of the land in 1 Kings chapter 4 and verse 20? What's it say about the people?
A lot of them.
There were a lot of them,
They were happy.
and they were happy. Everything seemed to be going great on the one hand. And you go and you read the first 10 chapters of 1 Kings, and you see that almost everything seemed to be going really good. But then I want you to look at something, a really slight thing. Look up at verse 6 of 1 Kings chapter 4. There at this part, the first 6 verses of 1 Kings 4, it's kind of like what you might think of as a cabinet of the king. In other words, who's in charge of what? Who does Solomon put in charge of the military? Who's the kind of the secretary? Who are the priests? Who are the ones? And down in verse 6, it says there's a man by the name who's Ahishar, who's in charge of the palace, and Adoniram, the son of Abda, was in charge of what? Forced labor. Interesting. Forced labor. Is everybody going to be happy if they are forced labor? Probably not. And that's going to become something very important. And one of the people who was in charge of forced labor under Solomon at another time was a man by the name of Jeroboam. And he's going to become very important in this story eventually. But then there's another issue that's going on with Solomon. Now, what do we know about Solomon in his marital issues? Jamie, you're like,
He's out of his mind.
out of his mind. Because what do we know about Solomon? How many women is he married to? He's got 700 wives, 300 concubines. Now, even if they are just really cheap and love their gifts from Dollar General, right? How expensive is that going to be?
Christmas time is terrible.
Christmas time is just going to be awful. How are you going to remember all the birthdays every year? How are you going to do all these things? It's going to get really expensive. Down in verse 7 there of 1 Kings 4, we're told that he had 12 officers over all Israel whose job it was to provide food for the king and his household. Now, we know that Israel and Judah was a nation of probably a couple of million at this point. But imagine you've got a king sitting on his throne in Jerusalem, and he's got 1,000 wives. And imagine how much that's going to cost. And then think about all the things Solomon's trying to do. What are some things that Solomon did during his reign? What did he build? He built a temple. Does that cost money at all? He also built an incredible palace. Just this monumental palace for all of his wives. And I'm sure there's probably other palaces there as well. He also built other building projects. He built fortresses. He built up the army. Now, again, taking this into modern times, do those things cost money? Absolutely. And it probably cost a lot of money. And considering there was a lot of forced labor at this time, there's likely some resentment that's starting to build with the people over time. Now, go to chapter 11, 1 Kings 4, or 1 Kings chapter 11. You start seeing some of the trouble that's going to eventually come to a head. Now, again, the first 10 chapters of 1 Kings are almost all good. Solomon's a wise guy. He does a lot of great things. He's building the temple. But then in chapter 11, the first 8 verses tell about what happened with all those wives. He says he loved many foreign women, along with the daughter of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, Hittite women. Now, what's the problem with that? What are those foreign wives bringing into Israel?
Foreign gods.
Idols, foreign gods. Now, no matter how intent Solomon is to be faithful to the Lord, some of that stuff's going to creep in. And this becomes a very real problem. And it leads to trouble with the kingdom. And as we're going to see in just a second, Rehoboam's mother is an Ammonite. In other words, she's not a Jew. And so that's going to, again, bring some very real troubles. Starting in verses 14 down through 40 of chapter 11, there's a whole list of all these problems that Solomon had and how the Lord raised up adversaries. But you can sum up the end of Solomon's reign starting in verse 9 of 1 Kings chapter 11. Karen, do you have that? Could you read 9 through 13 of 1 Kings 11?
The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. So the Lord said to Solomon, "Since this is your attitude, and you have not kept my covenant and my decrees, which I commanded you, I will most certainly tear the kingdom away from you and give it to one of your subordinates.
And down through 13, if you will.
Nevertheless, for the sake of David your father, I will not do it during your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. Yet I will not tear the whole kingdom from him, but will give him one tribe for the sake of David my servant, and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen."
Now, this is about as true as any prophecy or forecast as to what's going to happen as anything you'll ever read. Because what happens, what the Lord has said here is exactly what comes to pass in our story for tonight. And so we already have seen the roadmap. So that's kind of the backstory of Rehoboam. So Solomon has this 1,000-wife thing going on. But Rehoboam is going to be the one who's going to become a king. And in chapter 12, we see how he comes to power. So we're going to start by telling the story of his reign. We can get an idea that because Rehoboam was the son of Solomon and the grandson of David, Judah was probably very happy for Rehoboam to come and be the king. He's a Judite. He's one of them. But something happens. I want you to look at verses 1 through 5 of 2 Kings chapter 12. Nancy, would you read that?
2 Kings?
Oh, I'm sorry, 1 Kings. I'm sorry, 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 1 through 5.
Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. And as soon as Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, heard of it, for he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon, then Jeroboam returned from Egypt. And they sent and called him, and Jeroboam and all the assembly of Israel came and said to Rehoboam, "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore lighten the hard service of your father and his heavy yoke on us, and we will serve you." He said to them, "Go away for 3 days, and then come back again to me." So the people went away.
Okay. Now this is important. What have we seen about Rehoboam's lineage at this point? How did Solomon's reign end? Not very good. There's forced labor. The taxation is just out of this world. How are you going to support so many people? It's almost as if, the royal palace in Jerusalem has overstepped its bounds. And so even though Judah may be okay with that, all these northern tribes up here, they got a problem. And so Rehoboam goes to where in order to become identified as king? What's the city he goes to? He doesn't go to Jerusalem. Where does he go? He goes to a city called Shechem. See, right there in the middle. Here's the north, here's the south. Shechem is right there in the middle. Looks like my battery is going out on that thing. Shechem is right there in the middle. It's in the territory of Ephraim. Now, he's probably going there to consolidate his kingship and to receive the blessing from all the tribes of Israel. So now here's the thing about Shechem that's important. Shechem, remember I told you the story in Judges chapter 9 about a man by the name of Abimelech? Abimelech, who had been king for about 3 years. Where do you think that Abimelech had tried to go and be a king? Shechem. Evidently, Shechem was seen as a very important place for anybody trying to consolidate their power and their authority. It was a major city of the northern tribes. And considering that the kingdom has been united under Saul, David, and Solomon for less than 100 years, likely Rehoboam is going there to ensure, hey, I got to keep these northern people on my side. Because a lot of people are unhappy at this point. But here's what happens. He goes there, and he's confronted by a man by the name of Jeroboam. Jeroboam was a political exile. At one time, he had been Solomon's head of forced labor. And we're going to read more about his story next week. But Jeroboam comes and represents all these people who are very upset about things. And what is it that Jeroboam says to Solomon?
Lighten the load.
Lighten the load. Your dad, he just burdened us like nothing else. You've got to lighten the load. Now, if Rehoboam had half the wisdom of his dad, Solomon, what would Rehoboam do? Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Starting in verse 6, though, Rehoboam goes and he takes counsel from some of the old men, some of the people who had stood there with his father Solomon, some of the people who, Solomon had depended upon. And what do those men say? Lighten the load. You need to listen to them. And it says down in look down in verse 7, if you will be a servant to this people today and serve them and speak good words to them when you answer them, for they will be your servants forever. In other words, do what they're asking and everything's going to go great. Unfortunately, he's a young man. And what do young men often do when it comes to the words of old men?
Go against it.
What? You go against it, you ignore them. Hey, those guys said this. Hey, you're my buddies. You're the guys I grew up with. I'm going to go and listen to what you guys have to say. So down in verse 10, the young men that had grown up with him said to him, this is verse 10, you shall say to the people who said to you, your father made our yoke heavy, but you lighten it for us. Thus shall you say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's thighs. In other words, I'm much more of a man than my dad was. And now, whereas my father laid on you a heavy yoke, I will add to your yoke. My father disciplined with you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. Now imagine that for just a second. If this had been Solomon said, you guys are out of your mind, hopefully. But Rehoboam says, that's a really good idea. And so 3 days later, he goes back and he starts talking to people and says exactly what his friends told him to say. And so what do you think's going to happen? He's deaf to the concerns of his people. His father had already received a property that everything was going to fall apart. What do you think's going to happen? Look down in verse 16. This is the beginning of the civil war. And when all Israel saw that the king did not listen to them, the people answered the king, what portion do we have in David? We have no inheritance in the son of Jesse. That's very important. Remember, what's Jesse of? Of Judah. Those Judites. That's not us. We're going our own way. To your tents, O Israel. Look now to your own house, David. So Israel went to the tents. The Rehoboam reigned over the people of Israel who lived in the cities of Judah. Then King Rehoboam sent Adoram, who was taskmaster over the forced labor. Do you think that was a good idea? The slave master? Let's send the slave master in. That's a good idea. And all Israel stoned him to death with stones. And King Rehoboam hurried to mount his chariot to flee to Jerusalem. So Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And when Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was none that followed the house of David, but the tribe of Judah only. So they go and they send the taskmaster of forced labor. And what do with that guy? They kill him. They assassinate him. They stone him with stones. And Rehoboam only gets out by the skin of his teeth, gets in this chariot, heads back to Jerusalem, where he's going to find safety. And so the people of the north, they create a new kingdom. Create the kingdom of Israel. And in the south, there's the kingdom of Judah. Now, at this point, just real quickly, we could say that Rehoboam's first instinct, when he loses his kingdom, he loses all those northern tribes. What's his first instinct, do you think?
Take it back by force.
I'm going to go take that back by force. So it says, starting in verse 21, that he assembles 180,000 people, and he gets them ready for war. But then, fortunately, a prophet comes by the name of Shemaiah and says, don't do that. And it's amazing, Rehoboam actually listens. And he doesn't go to war against Jeroboam. Now, evidently there was some sort of warfare that was going on, because over in chapter 14 and verse 30, it says that Rehoboam and Jeroboam, Israel and Judah, were at war during this whole time. So maybe it wasn't some big colossal war, but there was probably border skirmishes right there. Jerusalem's right here. The border's only about 10 to 15 miles to the north. There's probably some real skirmishes. They're trying to figure out who's going to take Benjamin, who's going to be in charge of that land. And so they're probably skirmishing a little bit along the way. No big warfare, but a little bit's going on. You know, they're just trying to look out for their security however they can. So any thoughts or any questions to this point? Anything that maybe you saw that stood out to you? Well, if there's nothing, let's turn in your Bibles over to 2 Chronicles. Because 1 Kings doesn't tell us about what we're going to read about in 2 Chronicles. 2 Chronicles chapter 11. 2 Chronicles chapter 11, the writer here tells a story, but he tells it in just a little bit different way. He goes and he starts in verse 5 of 2 Chronicles chapter 11 by talking about all the fortresses that Rehoboam built up. And the fortresses that Rehoboam builds up are not to the north, interestingly enough. They're actually to the south and to the west. And that's going to become important later, because what's to the south and to the west? The Philistines and the Egyptians. And as we're going to see in a little while, Rehoboam had some real problem with the Egyptians. But there's something else that happens that's really important. I want you to look at verses 13 down through verse 17 of 2 Chronicles 11. Jamie, do you have that?
The priests and Levites from all their districts throughout Israel sided with him. The Levites even abandoned their pasture lands and property and came to Judah and Jerusalem, because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. When he appointed his own priests for the high places and for the goat and calf idols he had made, those from every tribe of Israel who set their hearts on seeking the Lord, the God of Israel, followed the Levites to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices to the Lord, the God of their ancestors. They strengthened the kingdom of Judah and supported Rehoboam, son of Solomon, 3 years, following the ways of David and Solomon during this time.
All right. Now, we're going to read more about what Jeroboam did next week. But suffice to say, Jeroboam did a number of things to change the worship of the northern tribes of Israel. He created 2 golden calves, one of them way up north and one of them way down south, almost into Judah. He made it where the priesthood, you didn't have to be a descendant of Aaron. That anybody, if they wanted to, could be a priest. And it also appears that he brought in idolatry in these places as well. And so instead of just worshiping the one true God, you could worship whatever you wanted at some of these high places. So, if you're a true, faithful follower of the Lord, what are you going to do? If you're stuck up in the north, you're a resident up here, but you're supposed to go worship down here. What are you going to do? Evidently, what we see right here is that there's a lot of people who looked at what Jeroboam was doing and said, we can't stay here. And so they migrate down to the south. It says that the Levites who were truly devoted to the Lord, they moved south, and then other people followed them as well. And so the south becomes sort of a place where refugees go to leave that idolatry and follow the one true Lord. See, they're seeking religious purity, and so they come to Jerusalem and they strengthen Jerusalem by their presence. I think that's just kind of a neat thing, isn't it? That these people thought so much about their faithfulness to God that they were willing to leave their fields, they were willing to leave their lives behind in order to go and faithfully worship God. I think that's just kind of impressive myself. Now, turn back, if you will, to 1 Kings chapter 14. We're coming near the end of Rehoboam's reign. 1 Kings chapter 14. Even though Rehoboam kept worshiping the Lord in a true way, there was a lot of things that Rehoboam did that were really quite foolish. 1 Kings chapter 14, starting in verse 21. Steve, would you read 21 down through verse 28?
Rehoboam, son of Solomon, was king in Judah. He was 41 years old when he became king, and he reigned 17 years in Jerusalem, the city the Lord had chosen out of all the tribes of Israel in which to put his name. His mother's name was Naamah. She was an Ammonite. Judah did evil in the eyes of the Lord. By the sins they committed, they stirred up his jealous anger more than those who were before them had done. They also set up for themselves high places, sacred stones, and Asherah poles on every high hill and under every spreading tree. There were even male shrine prostitutes in the land. The people engaged in all the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem. He carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything, including all gold shields Solomon had made. So King Rehoboam made bronze shields to replace them and assigned these to the commanders of the guard on duty at the entrance to the royal palace. Whenever the king went to the Lord's temple, the guards bore the shields, and afterward they returned them to the guard room.
All right, so first thing you see that Steve read about, verses 21 through 24, what starts coming back into the land? Idolatry. Now, it doesn't seem that it's taking place in the temple precincts itself. But all the high places that people used to worship, the gods that people used to worship before the Israelites drove them out, those seem to be coming back into the land. Now, remember, what's one of the reasons that they started coming back? Remember why they started coming back?
Get away from idolatry.
Well, the people from the north went south to get away from idolatry. But why was the idolatry coming back into the land? All the stray wives, I like that. 700 wives, 300 concubines, right?
They knew where home was.
But they brought all their stuff in. And so somehow that filtered back out to the people. And, it was likely that some of these people wanted to go back and do those things again. And there were probably, this region back here, this probably was not just purely Jews at this point. There were probably a lot of Ammonites and Philistines and Moabites and other groups that were there as well who continued to practice their idolatry in secret. But now it started to become something that was open and brought out in, where people were doing it openly. And so twice, it's interesting, down in verse 21 and then down in verse 31, twice, Rehoboam's mother's name is mentioned, Naamah, and she is called an Ammonite. Now, a lot of times, we don't really find out things like that about the mothers or things like that. But when they do occur, there's usually a reason. And when they occur twice, you see that there's something much more important. Do mothers ever have big influence over their kids, even into their 40s and their 50s? Absolutely. And evidently, the fact that she is mentioned twice and described an Ammonite meant that she had some power and influence over her son. And so the fact that she does these things, she probably enabled a lot of the idolatry into this land. But then starting in verse 25, we find one of Rehoboam's greatest foreign policy mistakes. There's a king by the name of Shishak who is from Egypt. Now, you can't see on this map, but Egypt is right down over here, okay? Egypt, as we know, had been a great power for many years and would be a great power for years afterward. And sometimes they were strong, sometimes they were weak. But Shishak goes and looks at Jerusalem. And remember, what did Solomon bring to Jerusalem over and over again? Gold, wealth, prosperity. And when a foreign nation sees what was going on in Jerusalem, what do they start thinking? We got to get some of that. So Shishak comes, and Rehoboam is not nearly as wise as his father Solomon. Shishak comes, and he's a great, powerful man, and he goes, and it just says he took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. We don't even know about the war. We don't know how much the Jews even fought at this point. We just know that Shishak comes in, basically takes what he wants, and leaves. It's probably a real time of humiliation for the people of that land. And it'll become a prelude what will happen over the next few hundred years, when wealth and treasures that Solomon and David had acquired because they had been blessed by the Lord fall into the hands of a foreign power. You know, they go and they take these gold shields that Solomon had made. And what does Rehoboam create in response? Bronze. Bronze nearly as prosperous and valuable as gold? No. And it's interesting. I kind of find it interesting, verses 27 and 28. There's almost this ritual that takes place. Every time that the king goes to the house of the Lord, what do the guard do? They go and bring out these shields. These substitute shields of bronze are decorations to be protected. There's no real, value to those things just beyond decoration. They're not used as actual tools of defense. They're just there to say, look, we're still kind of powerful. We're still kind of prosperous. It's almost kind of like the writer saying, this was kind of sad. It was sort of pathetic. Even in just 17 years, what happened to the land under Rehoboam. We've kind of closed Rehoboam's life there in verse 29. Now, the rest of the acts of Rehoboam and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? And there was war between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. And Rehoboam slept with his fathers and was buried with his fathers in the city of David. His mother's name was Naamah the Ammonite, and Abijam, his son, reigned in his place. So what's our verdict of Rehoboam? That's something we're going to try to think about each week. Some of the things that kings do, we'll see some good, we'll see a lot more bad, but sometimes it's a mixed bag. I do think that we have to question whether or not Israel or Judah was ever going to stay together forever. Who knows? Who knows whether or not that they could have stayed much longer than this? What do we find about nations when we look at history? Did the British Empire stay together forever? No. In many of your lifetimes, we've seen nations like Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Korea, the Soviet Union that have broken apart. There's great concern amongst many that same may happen in our country someday. But Solomon's sin predetermined what was to come. But we ask, did it have to be like this? Rehoboam had a lot going against him, but his foolish response to his people sealed his fate. When leaders are arrogant, when they deal with very real complaints, that doesn't go down well with people. I think that you could say the same thing in our world even today. When we think that our leaders aren't listening to us, we get very upset about this. Rehoboam wasn't all evil, according to 2 Chronicles 11. He made a place for all these exiles to come and worship the Lord, but he also allowed idolatry, and he allowed sin in that way. Rehoboam did not seem willing to fully take on the challenge of following the Lord. And the question of leadership and righteousness often go hand in hand. Will we be a people who say we're going to follow and honor and serve the Lord completely? Or are we just going to go our own way? Sometimes these stories seem really distant to us, but sometimes stories like this made me think a lot. How much are things much different than they were 3,000 years ago? I'm not sure things are that much different than they were then. Faithful leaders always need to give glory to the Lord and listen to the concerns of the people. Comments or thoughts? Anything else that you think about Rehoboam?
Well, his fate was kind of set already. I mean, God had said, once you're dead, everything falls apart. So
Yeah.
I guess a lot of people best.
Rehoboam was a young and then a middle-aged man. He was 41 years old when he became king. So he saw what was going on during his dad's reign, didn't he? Absolutely. He saw the things that his father had done. Question is, did he learn those lessons? No. He did not.
Actually, he did.
Oh.
He learned to follow exactly what Dad was doing, pretty much.
Yeah. And that wasn't a good thing, was it?
No.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes we learn all the wrong lessons, don't we? Instead of learning the lessons of righteousness and the lessons of goodness.
I think this is a lesson to us as parents and grandparents.
Uh-huh.
A lot of times we do things that we just don't think is going to affect future generations. This is me.
Mm-hmm.
I want to do what I want to do. Everybody else, they're going to be fine. But they're not always fine.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an old expression, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Sometimes I see kids and I see kids who don't make some of the same mistakes that their parents did. They watch and they learn. But then I see a lot that, unfortunately, they end up just like their parents. And that's not always a very good thing. So, what else? Anything else you think of when you think of Rehoboam? Well, next week, we're going to look at Jeroboam. What we're going to do over the first 6 or 7 weeks is we're going to kind of alternate back between the north and the south. Today, we looked at the south mostly. Next week, we're going to look about what happened with Jeroboam, that king up north. Did he do what was right? Did he do what was good? Even if a prophet came to him and said, you're going to be a king. If you'll just follow the Lord, you will have a house forever. We're going to find that Jeroboam, went one step further than Rehoboam in doing bad things. And so next week, we're going to look at Jeroboam the turncoat and see what that meant for the people of Israel. And I hope and I pray that this will be a series that you guys will enjoy. I love this stuff, and I hope I present it well. But, there's so many lessons that we can learn from those kings and queens all those thousands of years ago. So let's close with a prayer, and then we will be dismissed. Thank you, O Lord. I pray, Lord, that you will help us to follow you with all of our heart. Lord, we know that these stories here in the middle of the Bible are stories maybe we don't read very much. We think that it's just kings in a far-off land, a far, far long time ago. But I pray, Lord, that you'll help us to see that these are written for our instruction, so that we and our nation and our people can understand what it means to follow you completely, and also see the dangers of what happens when we don't follow you. I pray, Lord, that you'll bless us tonight. Be with the many who are struggling with COVID right now. Be especially with the Cole family for all the troubles that they have had. I pray that you will just continue to bless Autumn after having her baby this week. And I pray, Lord, that you will continue to bless Tate and her little baby as they are home now, and we're thankful for that. Lord, forgive us of our sins. Help us to follow you with all of our heart. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Oh, and I guess I didn't mention it before, but if you have not heard, Autumn had her baby on Monday. So they end up doing a cesarean, and I guess mother and baby are doing fine. So.